Is this going to be recorded also?
Yeah, the recording was started from my end.
Okay.
It's going to be a YouTube live also.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think the Abraham sent out a link like 2 weeks ago. There was a link with all the YouTube links, for each day. So it's gonna be live streamed.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, I'd like to see it afterwards, if possible.
Sure, of course. You got it.
Thank you.
Also, you're more than welcome to put all this material on Git and share that Git link with us. So that way, it will be, I did it that way. So if you want to do that, it'll be good.
Okay, yeah, I will. I'll upload the documents I show into a GitHub repo, and then I'll send you the link.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So I think we can start.
Yes.
Okay. Welcome all the participants. Welcome to another great session. That is day 6 of our workshop that is titled Machine Learning Applications in Drug Discovery from Basic to Advanced. Today we have the invited speaker Saad Khan with us to show the demo related to module 3, which is on coding a simple artificial neural networks to do secondary structure predictions using Python. Mr. Saad, he obtained his BSc degree from New York University. Now currently Saad is the 6th year PhD student at Albert Einstein College of Medicine in the lab of Libusa Kelly. His broad area of research is the development and application of novel statistical methods to big data problems in the life sciences and specifically in the topic of interpretable machine learning. His thesis research focuses on the systems biology of human microbiome, which specifically addressing the question of what exactly defines a healthy microbiome and further deals with the challenges of how noisy and interconnected our microbiomes are with our own physiology and lifestyles. He uses statistical and machine learning techniques to identify bacteria which consistently underlie disease states and considered as biomarkers of dysbiosis. He has developed classification models to detect various diseases such as colorectal cancer from metagenomic samples of the microbiome. Saad has been currently working on methods to decouple noise in microbiome data in order to identify biomarkers that are specific to individual pathologies. He has got various fundings like T32 Fellowship on Geographic Medicine and Emerging Diseases and also Einstein Medical Scientist Training Program. He has obtained resource grants such as Google Cloud for Research Grant, that is $5,000 in cloud credits, and also the NVIDIA GPU Research Grant. He has published several research publications in high impact factor journals. I would now request Mr. Saad Khan to start his presentation.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. So I want to go through a few different things in this workshop. I want to make it a little bit interactive. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen here. And I'm going to just start by just showing you what I plan on going through today. So I have some slides and I have some notebooks that I want us to walk through. Really, we want to be a mix of those things and try to be interactive and let you guys ask questions, because really the difficulty in machine learning is really like getting your hands on it, and it's really the actual implementation details and knowing how these libraries work and understanding how to navigate them. So I really want to help you guys get through that today rather than being too bogged down in a specific example. And so what I have sort of in mind is, first I want to just walk through how to install these dependencies. So I don't know how familiar people are with Python and the entire data science stack. So I just want to briefly mention that. Then I'm going to go to the whiteboard. I'm going to just, on my other device, I'm just going to sort of illustrate some basics of how neural networks work and try to give you some intuition about why people use neural networks. After that, I'm going to go through some demos of how Pytorch works and a basic, demo of like a basic neural network, just a standard example. Then I'm going to get into some more advanced stuff. So really, we're talking about proteins here. We're talking about chemistry. And I'm going to get into some methods that are useful for these types of things. In particular, something called geometric deep learning. And I'm going to give some examples of how you can apply this in a drug classification task. So first off, how familiar are people? Does everyone have Pytorch installed? I think I listed, there was some requirements, prerequisites list somewhere. People want to, can anyone let me know like how many people here have Pytorch installed or not? Everyone's on mute, so it's okay. I'll just briefly walk through this. So Pytorch is the library that is one of the most popular for neural networks. The two most popular libraries are Pytorch and TensorFlow. And so Pytorch is the one that I use a lot, and the one that I'm going to be using for this one is very well documented. If you go to their website, you can definitely see it. And so I just want to bring this up so that while I'm doing didactic, if you guys want to just install this in the background, if you haven't already, you can. But the simplest way to install it, if you're using pip, is you just do pip install torch. So, I mean, I can just show you. You open a terminal and you just do pip install torch, right? And I already have it installed, so it's fine. The other thing that I'm going to walk you guys through is a library called Torch Geometric, which is a little more complicated to install. So this one, it's okay if you can't install it because I'm going to show you a Google Colab notebook with everything pre-installed. But if you ever want to use this in your own research, you're going to have to install it. And so installing it requires you to follow these instructions. You have to do these in the correct order. So you have to like get your Python version as it says here. You have to then get the CUDA version here. If you have CUDA, which is the GPU system that you use to accelerate these things, and you have to follow these instructions in order. So if you have any questions about installing this, you can let me know. But I'm going to use this later on in a demo. So yeah, so we're going to be using Pytorch. We're going to be using Python. We're going to be doing things in, I have some Jupyter notebooks that I'm going to share with you guys. And so you guys will be able to have the link. I'm just going to walk through them. So there's no other questions. I'm going to move on to just introducing you guys to some basics about how neural networks work. Okay. Let me stop sharing. Let me get on this thing. Okay. All right. So let me start with an example to motivate why we do this stuff. So the example is very abstract. So you have some space that you're in, and let's say you have some shapes, some points in your space, okay? And there's blue X's and there's red circles. This is the example that motivates all of machine learning. And the question you want to ask is, draw a line that separates the points. Okay. Now, why would you want to do that? Well, these points could represent something meaningful to you. So perhaps they represent whether or not a drug is soluble. Perhaps they represent whether or not protein has some property that you're interested in. And perhaps the X and Y axes are parameters that are important to you in regards to that, you know. And so you want to be able to use these parameters to identify whether or not what you're looking at has the features you're interested in. And so how do you do this? Well, intuitively, you want to draw a line that looks like this, right? You want to draw a line that somehow is as close to in between them as possible. Of course, you're never going to be perfect because some of the things overlap. So you can almost never draw a perfect line. You might also think, why does it have to be a line? I mean, why can't I draw a curve? And basically get really clever and do something like this and say everything to the right of this green line is going to be red. Everything to the left of this green line is going to be blue. I mean, what's wrong with this? Does anyone want to describe what might be wrong with the example I just gave? Okay, I can just keep going. I mean, the problem is that you get this problem of overfitting, which is that this is extremely unrealistic. You know, you're fitting to the particular noise in this data set. In real life, like if you say this is your training data set and now you trained your model, which is this green curve, there's no way the actual data is actually shaped like this, right? If you add more data points, for example, there might be a red circle here. There might be a red circle here. There might end up being a blue circle over here. In other words, when you take this model and you put it in the real world, it might fall apart because you overfit it to your data. And so you have this trade-off between wanting to be simple and fit your data in a way that's accurate, and also wanting to maximize your accuracy. And so everything stems from here. And so if we go back to the example of the line, we can ask ourselves, how do we find the line that separates the points? Now, there's a lot of different ways you can think about that. For example, there's something called a support vector machine. I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about a very simple model called logistic regression. Okay, so let's move on to a new window. And so I'm going to explain what logistic regression is. And it's important because logistic regression is the foundation of neural networks. Logistic regression is like the building block. Okay. The idea is that you want to classify points that can either be, that are binary. So they can either be 0 or 1. So in other words, I mean, it's called logistic regression. So you can tell by the name that has something to do with regression. And this word logistic, it has something to do with the logistic function, which is this sigmoid shaped curve, which looks like this. Okay, so you know, if these are your axes, your logistic function looking something like this. Maybe a little shifted to the left, but whatever, right? The point is that it's 0 for a long time, and then it's 1 for a long time after that. And the idea is that if I go back to the example that I drew on the previous one, with the points that I want to separate, the idea is that if I draw my dotted line, everything to the right of this line should be assigned the number 1. Okay. Everything to the left of this line should be assigned the number 0. And so if I can map points in this space to this function, and I can say that everything to the left is here, everything to the right is here, then I'm good. In other words, if I want to classify this point, I look at the distance between this point and this line, D, and I look at where D shows up on here. So in this case, D is positive, so I'm on the right. Maybe then I'm interested in, say, this point here. So how am I going to evaluate it? I look at the distance D. D is negative because it's on the left, so I go here, right? And I'm on the left, so I classify as 0. And that's geometrically the intuition behind what we're about to do. We're going to draw a line, and to classify points, we're going to look at where we are relative to that line. we're going to go to our logistic function and we're going to ask what number it gets assigned, 0 or 1. And it has very sharp in the center. So very few times will you be in the middle. If you are, you just round. So if you're like 0.6, you round up to 1. That's the strategy here. And so it's called regression because we're going to take this function and we're going to fit it to the data. And so the way logistic regression is formulated is that you say y equals sigmoid of, well, let me write it in a way that would be familiar to you, or familiar to someone who's seen normal regression, mx plus b. Oops. Okay. So it's just like normal linear regression, except I put this weird sigmoid thing. And sigmoid is a function where this is really the function. It's 1 over 1 plus e to the minus x. Okay. Another way of putting this is that sigmoid is going to be the probability that you can say that, in other words, it's going to be the probability that x equals 1, which equals 1 over 1 plus e to the minus x. And likewise, we're in our model, we're saying that the probability that x equals 0 is e to the minus x over 1 plus e to the minus x. You can formulate this in probabilistic terms. And if you add these two together, they'll sum to 1. Okay. And so we have this as our definition of what a sigmoid function is. And we have this thing. Okay. And so now our goal is, given some data, so we're given data y hat. Okay. Y hat is our observations. Find params such that y is close to y hat. Okay. So we're given data x hat and y hat, right? So we're given points on this thing along with labels. So y hat is either 0 or 1. X hat is where you are in the space. And you're trying to find parameters for this logistic regression such that you end up being close to y hat. Okay, so I can reformulate that. So the goal is that you want y minus y hat to be small. Okay, and what I mean by that is y is your model prediction, and y hat is your labels, your true data. Okay, so it's either 0 or 1 is your true data, and y hat is your true data. Okay, so how do we quantify this? We quantify small using something called cross entropy. So in other words, what this translates to mathematically is that we want to minimize over our parameters, which our options were m and b, this norm y minus y hat, called the cross entropy norm. And so what this is defined as the sum over every single data point that you have of each observation times the log of the prediction. Okay, so we want to minimize this function. Okay, we want to minimize this somehow. And remember, we defined y as this thing. It's 1 over 1 plus e to the minus mx plus b. Okay. So now the question is, how are we going to fit this? How are we actually going to do this? Well, we use a technique called gradient descent. Essentially what we do is we're going to take the derivative of this and we're going to try and set it to 0. And we're essentially going to go down the gradient. So this is called E. Okay, this is called E, which stands for error. And so what we're going to do is something called gradient descent. Which is to minimize the error by following its gradient. Okay. Why is there log function when minimizing the objective function? So cross entropy is a function that has a lot of very useful properties from information theory perspective. As I'm going to also show you when I work it out, the derivative ends up being very easy to compute. The log makes it extremely, everything becomes trivial. There's a lot of nice symmetry properties that go from it. If you do some reading on cross entropy, like you'll find there's a lot of useful theorems that come out of it. In principle, it shouldn't matter. So there's a theorem that in any finite dimensional vector space, all norms are equivalent. And so in principle, you could choose any norm that you want, as long as you're in a finite space, which we are. But for various practical reasons, it's easier to use cross entropy. And so if we were in a continuous space, we would use L2 norm, which is to minimize the squared errors. And you can do more fancy stuff, but people typically do this cross entropy thing. And so we want to minimize E with respect to its params, which are M and B in this example. So in other words, what we want to do is compute partial E, partial M, for example, and we want to follow it. So what do I mean by following it? What I really mean is that if you draw E, like let's say we have E on the y-axis and we have M on the x-axis and in some hypothetical space, and we like draw it, hopefully E is convex. It is convex in this case, and like you get something, whatever you get something, right? I think you actually get something smoother than this. You get something that is you get something like a hill, basically. Oops. You get something like this, okay? And let's say, for example, your current choice of M has you over here. You look at the derivative, and the derivative is like this, and you just follow it. You just draw an arrow, and you take a step in that direction, right? And now you end up here. You compute the derivative again, and then you follow it. You end up here. You follow it. You end up here, and you keep going until you reach a local minimum. That's gradient descent. Now you do this in many dimensions, which is why, like in one dimension, it looks super easy. But in higher dimensions, this is like a manifold, and you're essentially going down the manifold. So it's like a ball rolling down a hill. So that's gradient descent. And in order to do gradient descent, you just need to know the gradient. And so what we want to do is calculate this gradient. And so remember what we had is, so we want to calculate the gradient with respect to right, we want to calculate the gradient with respect to M of this error function, which is going to be this thing. Okay, now how are we going to do that? Well, let's just keep going and see what happens. Let's just take the derivative. So you're going to get y sub I hat over y sub I times partial y sub I partial M. Okay, I forgot to mention something actually. This is only half of the error function. So it's actually more general than this. We have to, okay, so let me go back to the previous board. this one. So it's actually, let me draw it, let me explain it differently. It's well, I'll just write what it is. It's this plus 1 minus y sub I hat times log of 1 minus y sub I. Okay, and what this really means is that this is the loss when y equals 1. And this is what happens when y equals 0, because y can only be 1 or 0. So if y equals 0, the thing on the left will go away. And if y equals 1, the thing on the right will go away. So basically, you have to account for both scenarios. And so if we go back to where we are over here, it's this thing. Oops. Plus 1 minus y sub I hat times log of 1 minus y. And so we take this, we took the derivative there, and then we have, oops, thing keeps drawing weird lines. Then we have plus 1 minus y sub I over 1 minus y sub I hat. And this plus becomes a minus because the minus comes out, times partial y sub I partial m. Okay, this is just calculation that I'm doing. Now what? Well, there is a property that you can take advantage of, which is, right, there's a property that you can take advantage of, which is that the way that the logistic function was derived, it wasn't just a function that I made up. It has a very powerful property, which is that partial y partial x equals y times 1 minus y. If you solve this differential equation, you'll get the expression that I gave for the logistic function. Yeah, and also this is derivative back to x, sorry. So basically, we do all that, and we can actually plug this in. And if we plug this in, we're going to get sum of, we're going to get y sub I hat times 1 minus y sub I minus 1 minus y sub I hat times y. And when you work it all out, you get that the gradient of E is going to be equal to, it's going to be equal to, I had it written down, it's going to be equal to y sub I hat minus y. So in other words, it becomes very easy to compute the gradient. Okay. The gradient of this error function just becomes the difference between your predictions and your labels. So if the prediction and the label are the same, you get a score of 0. If the prediction and the label are different, you get a penalty of 1. And the gradient just goes up as you do that. So very easy to compute. Numerically, you can do it very easily. Now, you wouldn't necessarily use gradient descent if you were just doing pure logistic regression. I mean, there's solvers that can do it faster, but this is very important to keep in mind because a neural network is essentially many gradient descents stacked on top of each other. So let's talk about that. So that's the principle behind the intuition behind logistic regression. Okay, so now let's talk about what a neural network is. So a neural network is essentially, you can think of it as multiple logistic regressions stacked on top of each other. So first, let's talk about a simple, what's called the Perceptron model. Okay, so the Perceptron is the classical original version of the neural network that people originally came up with. And in general, what you can think of is like one hidden layer neural network. Okay, so a one hidden layer neural net means you have a starting layer, you have your input, put your input into what's called a hidden layer, as the name implies, and then you go straight to your output. And so what is this hidden layer? So the way it works is your input is going to be some multi-dimensional value. So in the previous examples, we've been doing everything in 2 dimensions. So maybe this is x0 and this is x1. Like before, these are passed into a set of neurons here. You can have as many as you want. And so they're passed in, it's fully connected. So each x0 and x1 goes into each one. And each of these neurons is implementing logistic regression. It's implementing sigmoid of some weight function times the x. And so now we're in vector form. So w is going to be a vector and x is going to be a vector and b is going to be a vector. Okay. Or b is going to be a scalar because it's going to be multiplying this vector w, which is going to be w naught, w1. It's going to be 2-dimensional. X is going to come in as x naught and x1. And so that's going to be a dot product, which is going to give you a scalar, and then you're going to add a scalar to it. That's going to go in, and it's going to feed into this thing, which is going to be fed into sigmoid, and that's going to be the output of one particular neuron. And you have as many as you want. And then each of these neurons then goes to the output layer. The output layer is just going to be 2 neurons in this example, because I'm doing binary classification, a yes neuron and a no neuron. Okay. And this is another logistic regression. It's all fully connected. And so the yes neuron is just going to take the sum of its inputs. It's going to do what's called a softmax. So it's going to take, it's going to essentially take, it's going to take it's going to take its inputs. It's going to compute this function called the softmax, and it's basically going to do another logistic regression. And like I had in the previous example, you have probability of whatever you're looking at equals 1 is going to be like 1 over 1 plus e to the minus whatever it was. And then probability of z equals 0 is going to be e to the minus that thing over 1 plus that thing. You can generalize this to then say that it's the sum over, you can generalize this to multiple components. And so when you write it like this, it's not really clear why we do this, like what exactly is going on, right? So I want to draw a picture to demonstrate what is going on here, because the math is not necessarily the most obvious thing. What is going on here is that basically each of these logistic regressions is drawing a line. You know, if I draw a line here, you can define this line as having, you can define this line by some vector w and some bias b. Okay, so the vector w defines the slope of this line. In vector form, you can describe it. And essentially, if I have this function sigma of w dot x plus b, essentially what it's saying is that if you are to the right of this line, like if you are here, you'll get a 1, and if you're to the left, you'll get a 0. So just like before, you have a 1-0 regime. Now, what happens if I have multiple lines? Okay. If I have multiple, then I can partition my space into multiple zones. Okay. And that is really the idea here with this hidden layer. You are partitioning your data set into multiple zones. Here's a zone. I'll just color code the zones differently. Here's a zone. Here's a zone. Another zone. These zones are defined by different combinations of whatever your neurons were, right? So each of these lines represents a neuron. That's what it's supposed to mean. And each neuron is either going to be 1 or 0, depending on where you are. So let's say, for example, we are here, okay? What is the neurons going to be? Let's say that this is neuron A, this is neuron B, and this is neuron C, okay? Let's say we have 3 here that we're interested in, and we want to ask, what is it going to be X? If we're at X, what are these neurons going to be? So at X, we are to the left of A, right? So A is going to be 0. We are to the left of B, so B is going to be 0, and we're to the right of C, so C is going to be 1. So if we go back to our neural network, input, hidden layer, output, our hidden layer is going to be 0, 0, 1. So the neurons are 1 or 0. That's why they're called neurons. It's all or nothing. And that's what it's going to look like. You're going to have zeros and you're going to have ones. And so you've done a lot of things here, right? First, you've come up with this geometric concept of what we're doing. We're partitioning the data into zones, and we're hoping that by partitioning it into zones, we can somehow improve our ability to make classifications. And we've also quantized the data. So the original thing that came in was continuous. We've now turned it into discrete. Like, it's technically still continuous because it's a continuous function, but essentially it's almost 0 or 1. And in the original perceptron model, it's exactly 0 and 1. What is some of our data? What if some of our data is over our neuron? What do you mean? Yeah, I don't understand the question, but like all your data, no matter where you are in this space, your neuron will have a 0 or a 1, because the domain expands the entire space. You can never exceed 0 or 1 because the sigmoid function is a function that takes you from, in this case, it takes you from Rn to the set 0, well, it doesn't take you to the set 0, 1. It takes you to the interval 0, 1. And you can approximate that it takes you to the set 0, 1. So you're always going to be within this constraint. So for a neural network with one hidden layer, this is what's going on. You can actually imagine what's going on. You can visualize it. And if you go back to the previous example with the X's and the O's, this is kind of a compromise. I'm not allowing you to draw any curve in the world because you would overfit, but I am allowing you to have some flexibility. And this flexibility is, in practice, tends to be a good trade-off. Now, the question is, people use the word deep learning. So what is deep learning? Deep learning just means you have lots of these layers. So you have an input, you have hidden layer 1, and as I showed before, instead of going straight to your output, you just do as many hidden layers as you want, and then you go to your output. Now, how does the intuition extend to this scenario? Well, this is really the big question that has been active area of research, is we don't actually have a good understanding of why this works as well as it does. And I think what I want to convey to you is that there is no special magic reason that this should work any better. The machine learning models that work well, what I want to convey to you is that they work well because they capture something about the geometry of the data that you're looking at. So what I mean by geometry is that the other consideration that we have to think about is, how do we represent our data to the system? So in the examples I gave, the data was just being represented as X, Y. It was just a coordinate system. But how do you do that for things that are not so naturally numerical? So for example, how do you represent an image? What's the most natural way to do that? Can you just do a matrix? If you just have a matrix of pixels, perhaps it's X and Y. You could, but it's going to be there, lots of problems can arise if you do that. So I'll talk about convolutional networks in a bit. What if you have a sequence? How do you represent a sequence as a numerical? Perhaps every component in the sequence can be a dimension. So if you have like a sequence with 10 letters, you have 10 dimensions. But then the question becomes, how do you represent letters? If you want to do deep learning on text, how do you convert text into numbers? Or if you want to do deep learning on protein sequences, how do you convert amino acids into numbers? There's, is there a natural way to do that? And more directly to this target audience is, how do we represent chemistry? Like, let's take a amino acid. And I mean, like, how do you represent this in a mathematical formation? How do you convert this into a vector? That is actually if you can answer this question, then you can do deep learning in chemistry, and you can actually you can make a lot of good discoveries. So the thing that really put deep learning on the map is when people figured out how to do it for images. And then people eventually figured out how to do it for sequences and text and stuff. And now in the past decade, people have figured out how to do it for chemistry. And yeah, I'll talk a little bit about convolutional nets, and then I'll go to examples. So convolutional neural networks. Why do they work? So the idea behind what a convolutional neural net is you have a picture, let's say, and you want to identify something in the picture. The idea is you break this picture down into little windows, and you operate on those windows at a time. And you make these windows overlap is the other thing. Okay, so it's like a sliding window. The window just slides through the thing. And whenever the window is over top of something important, then the window can detect something. And so the basic intuition is that your network learns to detect things within a window. So this window is over top of a person's face. So maybe this window will say, this is a face. And then the next layer in your network will then take that information and know that there's a face here, and they'll draw a window of windows. And so each layer in this architecture is going to learn some additional feature. So if you have a convolutional neural network here, so you have input, you have conv1, and then there's a bunch of other things that are peripheral to this, like pooling and stuff, but I'm not going to really mention that. Let's assume it's all baked in. Conv3, so on, output. What you're going to have in practice, the intuition for this is at the input, you have your raw pixels. Oh, okay. You have your raw pixels. And the next thing you're going to have in your conv1 layer is edges. This is what happens in practice. And this is also what happens in your visual cortex. Your visual cortex functions very similarly to a convolutional neural network. You have multiple layers of visual neurons. The first layer mostly detects edges, and it presents to the second layer a binarized version of those edges. So like ones and zeros that encode where those edges are present on your image. And the second layer, instead of operating on raw pixels, operates on knowledge of those edges, which is a more abstract piece of information, and it detects shapes. And, the next layer does the same thing. It takes shapes and, it makes composite shapes, and it keeps going over, on and on and on. You can keep adding layers, you can keep doing things here. And eventually, as you get higher and higher, you're able to capture really abstract concepts. And in your brain, you have entire sections of your brain that are dedicated to specific tasks. Like you have, a part of your brain that is dedicated to detecting faces. And if you have a lesion there, you actually can't recognize faces properly. Like if you see a person's face, you won't be able to, it's actually really hard to, like the fact that you can look at someone and recognize them immediately is an evolutionary thing. It's not something that comes naturally. If you had a lesion there, you wouldn't be able to do it. You'd get confused very easily when you saw people's faces. And so that's sort of the idea here. How is a convolutional net able to do this? And why are, like, any neural network, if you just throw data at it, you will not get this by default. You'll just get a mess probably. Like machine learning is hard. A lot of it is just you have to figure out how to optimize your parameters. It's nothing is automatically going to work like magically, like it may sound like it would. The reason that convolutional nets work so well is because they capture geometric properties of images. So if there's one thing I want you to walk away from at the end of this, is that machine learning works well when your model captures geometric properties of your data. So what do I mean by that? What are geometric properties of images? So if you've taken like physics or upper level physics, at some point you talk about invariance transforms like Galilean transform and various symmetry groups which define the laws of physics. You can think about the symmetry groups of images. One of the symmetries that we expect to have is something called translational equivariance, which is if I take this guy and I move him to the left, is this still a person? This is still a person. Even though I moved him to the left, I did not change the identity of this object. All I did was I shifted where he is. So this is a person at this position previously, right? Now this is a person at this position. So convolutional nets have a property called equivariance, translational equivariance. What that means is that because of how the convolution operation works, if you take a piece of data and you shift it to the left, your output is the same except shifted to the left. So in other words, what I mean is that f of x minus L is your shift, is going to be f of x minus L. It's translationally equivariant. And so this is a useful feature to have because in the real world, when things move around, their identity remains the same. So you might ask, what else can you do? Like, what else do you expect to be the same if I move an object? Like, let's say I have my hand, I move it to the left or right, it's still a hand. So if I want to detect hands, I better have a model that is, robust to that. You can also do up and down, that also works. Now, what are other things you might expect? If I rotate my hand, that's a transformation. This is still a hand, like my hand is still the same, even though I rotated it. So now how do you represent that? Well, it turns out that convolutional nets actually don't have this symmetry. And actually, this was one of the challenges in getting these things to work well. In the early papers, when people were like publishing the first sort of seminal like things that really hit the news on convolutional nets, what they would do is they would take their data and they would randomly rotate their images and they would assign the same label. So let's say this is a picture of my hand. They would make another copy of the picture rotated and they would still have the label hand on it. And so this way the model would be forced to learn this symmetry, but it's not baked into the model. And so this is a disadvantage of convolutional nets. But it turns out that the translational symmetry is still good enough that you can get good results, but it's not perfect. And actually there's research into finding models that are better at images because it's not just rotation. What if I rotate in the z-axis? This is kind of complicated because you're looking at a two-dimensional image. So in order to understand that I just rotated my hand this way, you need to have a model that understands that images are 2D representations of a three-dimensional world, and you can capture that. You get even more abstract with it, right? Like if I want to detect a face, how do you quantify the symmetry that is like nose, mouth, eyes, and ears? That's super abstract. And you can really get deep into thinking about what does it mean to capture that geometric property of images. A lot of the progress that has been made has been in statistically inferring these things. So we start with a very generic representation of our data, and we just throw lots and lots of data at it, like tens of thousands of training samples. And over time, the model will learn whatever the relationships are that it needs to in order to make the learning happen. But, the reason I'm bringing this up is because if we go back to the previous example that I gave about this amino acid, this is the one that we're most interested in, right? We're not interested in images if we're doing protein predictions. So how the heck do we represent this? So I'm going to get into that in a little bit, but first I want to just do a little tutorial of Pytorch. And then I think we'll get back to, I'll do a little walkthrough of what is called geometric deep learning, which is basically there's a way to quantify, numerically represent this as a graph. And then using graph theory, we're going to do neural networks on graphs. And that is like the essence of research in computational chemistry these days. It's the neural networks on graphs. And so let me stop sharing this. How do I stop sharing? Wait, let me save this first. Let me just wait. Stop share. Okay. And then I'm going to share my laptop. And we're going to do some Python. Okay. So I'm going to walk you guys through just like basic ABCs of Pytorch. So I have a notebook here. I had a notebook here. Let me do this one. Let me post this. Here it is. Let me post this in the chat and let me know if you guys can access it. Where do I post this? Just 1 second. Yeah, let me know if you guys can access this. I'm going to go back into sharing. Okay, so what is Pytorch? So maybe I should have drawn that before. Let me just show you pictures. Maybe that'll be better. So they have some good pictures here which explain how it works. So basically, Pytorch is not meant for neural networks. It's more general than that. It's a general system for doing gradient-based tensor arithmetic. So I don't have pictures here. Let me share my phone. Let me share my thing again so I can just show you really quickly, walk you through the idea behind how these things work. So I'm going to talk about the computer science or the engineering of neural network software. So next question that we're interested in is how do you train a neural network? It's harder than other forms of machine learning because in addition to you have to be familiar with all the other things you've learned, like training data set, cross-validation, loss function, all that stuff. But now you have a more complicated model and you have to train it using some sort of gradient descent. You can't just go into scikit-learn and hit train and forget about it. And so what you have is you have a few components. You have your data set. You have a means of iterating over the data set. You have an iterator because we're going to do something called mini batching. Typically, your data set is going to be too large to fit into memory. So we're going to take little chunks of it at a time. This is also better from a training perspective. And we're going to just randomly loop through the data set. Let's say you have 10,000. You're going to do like 20 at a time. So you need an iterator that can randomly sample from your data set. You need a model. You need your actual model, which is a function that's going to take input, produce output. You need a loss function. And you need a optimizer function. Okay, so the optimizer function is going to say, take the loss, compute its gradient, and then update all the parameters with respect to that. So this is the premise of what Pytorch gives you functionally. So you have data set. So you're going to have some Python class. So, you're going to have some class. You're going to give it a name or whatever. And it's going to have an init. And it's basically just going to be a class that you want to give it a get item method. So if you guys know magic methods in Python, basically what this is that you implement this method. And if you implement this method, then if you instantiate like an instance of this data set, you're going to be able to call different components of it. Like you can call the second component of your data set, you can call items from it. And this way you can randomly access things. Iterator is going to be similar, except iterator is in Pytorch, there's something called a data loader, which has all of the tooling built in to enable you to take one of these data sets. You have to create a data set yourself, right? You provide the data. Pytorch has a bunch of utilities for looping over it in the ways that people do in machine learning. I'm going to give you examples of models. So I'll show you how this works. The loss function, Pytorch has a huge library of loss functions, but basically at some point you're going to do like L of, out minus label, right? Like you're going to do at some point in your code, you're going to have a line that says like out equals model of in or something like that, like your input. You're going to produce an output, and then you're going to compute loss on that. So you're going to get loss equals this. And then you're going to do like optimizer dot update or something like that. And the optimizer will know that the loss has been computed, and it'll like magically, quote unquote, update all the parameters of your network based on that. Now, how does it magically do that? So the magic behind Pytorch, which is why people love it so much, is that Pytorch, so the essence of all these systems is they compute gradients using something called backpropagation. So if I have my network, if I have layer 1, layer 2, blah, 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 I have output. And if I want to compute the gradient, so what I do is add an additional step, and conceptually from your output, you compute a loss. And I want to compute the gradient of the loss with respect to the input. And I want to use that as my means of updating my parameters, right? And so if I want to compute partial of loss, this is like not like this is heuristics, right? Just this, what this means, right? Partial of loss with respect to in. Intuitively, what this is going to be is just chain rule is going to be partial of loss, partial of out, times partial of out, times partial of like ln, times partial of ln, partial of ln minus 1, blah, 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 times partial of L2, partial of L1. You see what I'm doing here? And then all the way down to partial of layer 1 with respect to partial of in. It's called backpropagation because first you compute the gradient of this, then you multiply, compute the gradient of this, and so on, and so on, and so on until you get to the beginning. And then if you have an optimizer, you then go back and update all your parameters based on that. So that's the idea behind backpropagation. And Pytorch, what it does is it keeps track of every single calculation that you've done. So if you actually run your neural network in the forward direction, it keeps track of all the layers that it has run, and it remembers that it ran them in this order. When you say backpropagate, it then goes backwards. It's like it's setting up a queue and then it's popping things off the queue and computing derivatives as it does so. And so as a result, you don't really need to like do any additional programming beyond just defining your model. It'll figure out the gradients and it'll do everything for you. And so it's important to understand under the hood what's going on. All of the frameworks do this. So TensorFlow also does this. It's important because this is not a framework for neural networks. This is a framework for tensor calculus, right? Which is more general than that. You can solve PDEs in Pytorch. You can solve you can do dynamical systems. You can do anything that involves tensor calculus in Pytorch. And I think it's important because neural networks are not just a magic pill that you throw at things. They're really part of a broader family of like how do we think about the geometry of data? And a lot of the up and coming research in the coming decades and beyond is really going to be about how do we go beyond neural networks and how do we bring in other fields of math to better understand these things. And so that's just some context about how this works. So now I'm going to go back to the demo. I'm going to share this. Okay, so hopefully you guys were able to open this notebook because I made it accessible by anyone who has the link. Yep. So this is basically, I'm just going to go through like the tutorial code that is on the Pytorch website already. I'm just going to walk through how the code works. You can obviously read this, but I just want to be very, go back to basics here. So we install Torch here. Fine, you can do that. And so what we're doing here is we're doing a bunch of imports. And then we're going to download this sample data set, which in this case is called Fashion MNIST. You're going to see what that looks like. And so this is built into Pytorch. And so the best thing you can do for your sanity is use data sets that are publicly available. The hardest part in machine learning is actually organizing your data. And if you're using a data set that someone else has curated, you're going to save yourself a lot of time. Anyways, we create something called a data loader. And so here's that thing that I told you, it iterates through the data, right? So we give it the original data set, and you can give it whatever parameters you want. You can actually do transformations in real time. You can do a lot of fancy stuff here. In this example, we just set the batch size. So when you iterate through this, you're going to get 64 pieces at a time. Okay. Let's go down here. So the next thing that I'm going to do in this example is just keep track of what device we're on. So if you have a GPU, and definitely recommend it if you're actually doing this, is to get a CUDA GPU, set that up. You can actually do all your stuff on GPU. I'm doing this in Google Colab, so it's all CPU based. Next, we're going to define a very basic neural network. This doesn't have the picture of what it is. I think I have on my laptop here. Let me see if I can show you what it is, what it looks like. This is what it's supposed. This is what the things look like. So, Fashion MNIST is a data set of extremely low resolution pictures of clothing, and so it's a little more exciting than traditional MNIST, which is just numbers, but it's still supposed to be really basic, it's like tutorial use code. And so, in your defining your network, you define a class, which is a subclass of neural network.module, and you just need two methods implemented. You need an initializer, and you need a method called forward. Forward is going to be how you evaluate your model. So in your initialization, you set up all the parameters. So in this case, if we look at what forward is doing, forward is literally just, it's calling this linear Relu stack of your input, which is then being flattened. So what this is doing is you start off with a two-dimensional array of pixels, and we're flattening that to a vector, which is a very basic thing you can do. We're taking that vector and we're running it through this sequence of layers. What are those layers? You have a linear layer, which is just, it's just a linear like logistic function. Then you have a Relu. So what I didn't mention is that you don't have to use a sigmoid. There's a whole family of activation functions, which are shaped like a sigmoid, but slightly different, and they have various properties. So Relu is one that's used. Here, I can just show you what a Relu activation looks like. It looks like this. It's called a rectified linear unit. It looks kind of silly, but it actually works very well in practice, and it's easy to compute as well. But anyways, this is essentially a three-layer network. You have one hidden layer, two hidden layers, three hidden layers. We run it through the hidden layers, put the output out, and that's basically what we're going to have. And so you just go through that, use an example of running that. So we just initialize a random tensor image. So it's a 28 by 28 pixel image. So Torch has, if you guys have used NumPy arrays before, PyTorch has an analogous system called tensors. So like coding live. I don't remember. I don't remember what the random function is. Let me try this. I'm just trying to give an example of a tensor. I'm not remembering syntax. Live. So, I mean, it's just an array, right? You can make these in any dimensions as you want. There's nothing fancy about it, but the point is that this is the data structure that Pytorch uses for doing things. And so what we can do is we can do a lot of things with this model. So what we have here is a model with a bunch of parameters. So what are those parameters? Model has a method called name parameters. You can actually look at them. So let me print this and show you guys that. What we're looking at here is all of the parameters in this model that we created. So each of these relus, these activation functions, they have a weight parameter and they have a bias parameter. So the weight parameter is just a matrix, the number of neurons by the size of each neuron. And these are the weights of each of those neurons. And you have a bias, which I explained before. The bias is just a scalar that comes at the end. This is your initialization. They're randomly initialized. Each layer has a bias and a weight neuron. So level 2 has one. Level 2 has a bias. You can see they automatically acquire names as well. And then this parameter requires grad is how you control whether or not the variable is one where backpropagation flows through and one where it doesn't. So you can really control how you want to propagate gradients. If you want to sort of, you can play around with the algorithms you use to train these networks. You can, for example, freeze a network. That's one strategy that people use for things like transfer learning. Essentially, someone gives you a pre-trained neural network, and then you want to adapt that network to your data set. You freeze their network and add layers on top of it, and you do additional training. And this enables you to get the benefits of their pre-trained network while also applying it to your data set. This is very commonly done these days. So anyways, in this example, we set a bunch of hyperparameters like a learning rate. We define a loss function and an optimizer, like I mentioned before. And we have this training loop. So I'll show you in the documentation where these are, but let's just keep going, right? So we just defined this loss function. We defined this optimizer. And we're going to define a training loop. So what this is going to do is it's going to loop through your data loader. So there's a for loop. We're just looping over the data loader. If you are using CUDA, you have to call .CUDA on your data, on your batch, so you can move the data from laptop memory to GPU memory. Then you evaluate your model, out equals model of in. You compute a loss, so loss function of prediction versus the true label. And then loss dot backwards basically says that starting at loss function, I want to compute all the gradients. I want to back propagate now, starting at loss. After you call this, every single thing that has a gradient is going to get its gradient updated based on whatever you have just done. And then optimizer.step is going to take this optimizer and it's going to move it forward one step based on the parameters you gave it. That's basically it. That is the core essence of it. And everything else is things that you've probably seen in other workshops and lectures about how machine learning works, cross-validation, ROC curves, all that stuff is stuff that you can now do around this framework. So we just run this and it should, the next one is one where we're going to run it. So we're just going to run it, for loop, and you can actually see it's running very slowly because it's running in the cloud. But that's really the essence of it. Okay, so that's fine. I think I tried to run it on CUDA for some reason. It didn't let me. but that's the essence of how this works. Let me go into the documentation. So now let's say you want to actually make one of these yourself. How do you go to the documentation? So there's a library, there's a bunch of libraries here. What you want to focus on is torch.nn. And you got everything you need here. You got layers. So they got predefined layers for every sort of thing you want to do. They have activation functions. They have a variety of things. So if you guys are familiar with regularization, there's all sorts of tricks you can do to improve the performance of your model. So if we go to like convolutional layers, you got your layers ready to go. So you don't need to implement these. They've already pre-implemented a variety of different things you can do. So you can really just like assemble them like Legos. I was talking about activation functions. You can also play with which activation functions you want to use. So this is something where machine learning is both an art and a science. You really have to think about which one makes the most sense for your data. And it's not, there isn't an answer. You know, you have to just experiment with these. And these all look different. There's also, see, and then there's also a whole bunch of loss functions that you can do. So the loss functions are in another module, which is, it's also an NN. Why isn't it here? Loss, or here's loss functions. Yeah. So someone asked before, like, why do we do cross entropy loss? You can do any of these loss functions. You can, you know, have fun, go crazy, margin ranking loss. And these all have, you know, there's research that people have done into experimenting with different loss functions. Some of these are for regression, some of these are for classification. So there's pros and cons of each. As far as the optimizer goes, there's also a module called torch.optim. And so optimizing is its own field. So I mentioned gradient descent. No one, I mean, people do use gradient descent, but there's a variety of more sophisticated methods that have things like friction and inertia and all sorts of things. Because in reality, your little hill is never a hill, it's always bumpy. There's all sorts of things that can happen. So there's actually a lot of nuance in every single thing that I mentioned. And if you go into them, you can get lost really easily. I think it's important to just focus on the essence of the loop that I described is data set, iterator, model, loss function, optimizer. Start with something simple and then focus on getting your system set up, focus on getting your benchmarks, your metrics, how are you computing the accuracy of your model, and then focus on optimizing it. And so do you guys have any questions about how Pytorch works? You know, I walked through a basic tutorial, which is really, you can find it here, Intro to Pytorch. I'm just going through the demo that they already provide, and you can go through more if you want. Does anyone have any questions before I move on to more advanced stuff? Okay, so I'm going to talk about geometric deep learning. So I mentioned before that this question of how exactly are we supposed to represent a molecule or a protein. And there's a lot of answers you could give. Like one example is maybe if you're doing proteins, you could represent as a sequence of amino acids. And then you use sequence learning methods on those amino acid sequences. So if you guys have heard of recurrent neural networks, the idea is basically, or if you guys have ever looked at like hidden Markov models, it's like a recurrent neural network is like a hidden Markov model, except using a neural network. So, you know, you have a neural network, it moves through your sequence, one amino acid at a time, and it's computing something until you reach the end. And you can maybe represent amino acids as a vector, like you have 20, for example, and, you know, each amino acid gets one vector in your space. You can do things like that. What people do now, well, people do that, but that's also a whole topic. I wanted to focus on one topic, which is geometric deep learning, because I think it's really cool. And so what I'm going to talk about is how to represent this is a really good paper. I'll post these slides. I'll send these to whoever. I'll post them on GitHub as well, so you guys can see. I really recommend looking at these papers if they interest you, because this is a very cool topic, right? It goes back to what is the shape of a data and how do we represent it in in a vector space such that we can do math on it. So I just had a bunch of, so like I already talked about this, right? But essentially what we're going to be asking ourselves is, this is a protein. We can either think of this as a manifold or as a really fancy three-dimensional graph. How can we quantify that graph? And so there's a lot of applications of this in biology. It's not just it's not proteins, it's chemistry, it's immunology, it's biochemistry, it's gene expression. This stuff shows up everywhere, graphs. And so I think it's very important for biologists to think about these things, because traditional machine learning research is people who are interested in like images and text and translation, and that's not what biologists typically work on. So I think for us, this is a particularly important topic. And so I'm going to go fast because I don't want to get bogged down in details, but sort of what I explained before about how convolutional neural networks work is sort of illustrated here, right? You have these convolutional layers, and it's just a little sliding window that goes through your image. It highlights different portions of your image, it activates differently, and as you go up the system, you're getting more and more abstract representations of your data. We want to do this now on graphs and manifolds. So how would you do it on a manifold? Like, let's say instead of a flat two-dimensional image, you had like a curved image, like the surface of that protein. You could intuitively maybe think, okay, I could maybe make a sliding window, and instead of sliding over it in like a grid, we could just slide across the manifold. Or maybe if I'm on a graph, I could have like a sliding subset of the graph, and I could just navigate through that graph, and that would be my quote unquote sliding window. And maybe I could use that to generalize this technique to other spaces. And that's really what we're going to try to do, right? So here's like another way of a mathematical representation of what the convolutional layer is. So this window slides and it's doing something, it's computing a dot product at each level. And so this is another way of looking at it, right? So I've explained this. And so what I talked about before about why this is important is you have a lot of cool properties. I talked about translational equivariance, which is that if you move an object to the left or right, it's still the same object. There's other things that come from convolutional networks, which I've written here, like, as you layer up, you capture hierarchical relationships. You have this ability to focus on small things in the image, so you don't get bogged down by high dimensional data. And so if we really want to generalize this to non-images, we have to go really abstract for a second. And to get really abstract, we have to ask ourselves what a convolution is. And if you've taken like a differential equations class, you've seen a convolution is an operation defined as such. It's defined as this integral. And this integral is really powerful. It shows up in a lot of places in like harmonic analysis and stuff, because it's the unique function, it's the unique operator that has the following properties. Well, the property I'll get to, I think, in the next slide, but it has a lot of really useful properties that we're going to take advantage of. So it's commutative, it's associative. So F star G is G star F, it's distributive. The delta function ends up being the identity when you do this. So it shows up a lot in signal processing applications because you have like spikes, which you represent as delta functions. And when you take convolution with respect to those spikes, it's like identity. And the really cool thing is that differentiation just goes straight through like this. So it shows up a lot in like Fourier analysis, solving differential equations using Laplace transforms, for example. A lot of these things, you have a kernel function, you take the convolution of the kernel with respect to whatever your data is. And that ends up giving you a way to solve the equation because derivatives just flow straight through. So there's a lot of good properties that make this very useful in a lot of fields of math. For us, what we care about is it commutes with translations. It is the unique operation that is translationally equivariant. So what I said before, that if I move something to the left, it's like if I did the operation and then moved it to the left. It doesn't matter when I move it to the left, before or after, it's all the same. You can show that this is unique. Now, why do we care about all this fancy business? It's because if we generalize this property to other spaces that are not Euclidean, then we can define convolution in those spaces, and we can define convolutional neural networks, right? So we're going to get super abstract. We're going to use the definition of convolution to define it in other spaces. And we're going to use that to do convolutions in other spaces. So, so how do we do that? So we generalize convolutions to, how do we generalize them? Let me just skip ahead a little bit. The way you do it is you break down, so you ask what the convolution does on the Fourier domain. I think, yeah, let me skip these slides because also in the interest of time. Let me go to, do you guys have any questions, by the way? Let me skip all this. So I'll post these slides. You guys can look at this. I feel like this might be too complicated. I don't know. I can't tell the temperature of the room, but I'm just going to skip to the pictures because I feel like that's going to be more useful. The general idea is that you can define convolution on a graph by defining a Laplacian on a graph. Laplacian function is like the operator you use when solving the heat equation, for example. So you define this Laplacian operator, which on graphs is equivalent to taking an average. So if you want to take the Laplacian at this point, it's going to be the average of all the neighbors. It turns out that the eigencomposition, you can define a Fourier decomposition of a graph by looking at the eigendecomposition of this Laplacian operator. And because of the relationship between Fourier decompositions and convolutions, you can define a convolution operator as multiplication in the Fourier domain. So that was a lot of ways to say that. Let's see, I wrote it down. Where did I write it? This is what I wrote, right? So the convolution theorem is what we use to do this. Essentially, that if you can define a Fourier transform on some space, then you can compute convolutions on that space because the Fourier transform of a convolution is the product of Fourier transforms. So this is a very powerful property that we're going to take advantage of, and it stems from the translational equivariance that I mentioned. If you are able to compute Fourier transforms, then Fourier transform turns convolution into multiplication, and vice versa. It turns multiplication into convolution. So you can think of your data existing in two spaces. You have your real space and your Fourier space. In the real space, multiplication and convolution are one thing. When you go to the Fourier space, they're reversed. So convolution of two functions in the real space is equivalent to multiplication of two functions in the Fourier space and vice versa. So taking the convolution of things is essentially equivalent to multiplying their spectrograms. If you think about breaking them down into their constituent frequencies. So if we can define Fourier transforms on other spaces, which we can because people do this, we can define convolution on those spaces. So what we had was a sliding window, which is equivalent to a convolution. We're going to replace that by saying, what's the Fourier decomposition of whatever we're on? We're going to then look at the Fourier modes of that thing, and we're going to multiply those modes by some kernel. And that's going to be how we define graph convolutional neural networks. That's the idea behind it. And really a lot of this has been coded up. People have really done a lot of research on this. There's a lot of algorithms that get into like, different ways to do this. And there's a whole like, there's so many things you can ask about this. Like, how do you compute these efficiently? For example, you have fast Fourier transforms in normal space, in Euclidean space. And this is why, like, using a GPU, for example, you're able to do machine learning, deep learning very fast. In graphs, you don't have these things. You don't have a fast Fourier transform. You can't break it down to matrix arithmetic really easily, which is what GPUs are good at. And so graph convolutional networks are actually a lot harder to do computationally. It's a lot slower to train these. There's a whole bunch of research into speeding these up. I'm not going to go into that, but I'll leave these slides. But the end result is that there's a bunch of examples that people have developed in the past few years. And I think one of the biggest ones, one of the like early ones that really set the tone that you can do this is this paper. So I definitely recommend reading this paper. Convolutional networks for learning molecular fingerprints. So what did they do here? They tried to compare two different ways to make what is called a fingerprint of a molecule. So one is this traditional way called a circular fingerprint. And then the other one they compared it is, what if we use a neural network to make this fingerprint using this graph convolutional approach or something like it that I mentioned. The molecular fingerprint, which is something that you can do without neural networks, is really this idea that we're essentially going to like flatten the representation. Like if you guys know what a Smiles representation of a protein of a molecule is, there's ways to encode the structure of a molecule in text, and people use this for like storing data, like databases of molecules will store them in text format. You take that string and you essentially hash it. Like it's essentially boils down to something like that. It's super basic. It doesn't really account for the structure of the molecule. The idea here was, well, let's take that as our starting point and let's actually train a neural network to take these atoms one layer at a time and compress them into some vector in which they might have meaning. And they're able to show that for a variety of different benchmarks, this works a lot better. And so this, ever since then, I think this was 2014 or 2015. It was 2015. There's been a lot of really cool work in this field. So people have done things like, well, this is that paper, right? So these guys were able to not only make predictions, but they were able to identify which parts of the fingerprint, which parts of the molecule most activated the neurons that corresponded to the prediction. So they were able to actually find like what's the functional group that's driving whatever they're trying to predict. This paper is really cool. So these guys were able to actually make a model that predicts chemical reactions. So the way they did it is they had graph representations of molecules, and they essentially spliced them together, and they had this model that predicts how those edges change. So they essentially are modeling the whole thing as like you have graphs and you want to move the edges, move the lines until you have a new graph, and you just want to predict how those edges move. And so they train this, they generate a set of candidates, they use some heuristics to remove candidates that are like physically impossible. And they use that to give a restricted set of like predictions. And they were able to show that their predictions are consistent with what a chemist might predict. And they were able to get some very interesting observations by looking at their network, looking at how the network assigns weights to different features, and really get some insight from that. I think one of the things that is currently an active area of research is how do we generalize this to proteins? I'm showing here examples of small molecules. Now, as you make the graph bigger and bigger, naturally, it's going to be harder to do the computation. It's also going to be harder to collect training data for it, because there are large databases of small molecules and people do high throughput assays. I mean, there still are large databases. You can go into PDB and get protein structures, and you could potentially try and predict things off of them. but the scale of a protein is so much bigger. So, making sense of that is actually something that is of active research. So that's something that I think if you're interested in doing research on just the development of these methods, is definitely worth looking into. But I wanted to sort of just present some more advanced techniques that people use. So I just wanted to go through that briefly. I can show a few examples of some data sets and do some walkthrough of actually doing this graph convolutional network, how you would do this in practice, so that if you guys are interested in it, you can have a starting point. Are there any questions about that? Okay. So we're going to move on. Let me post this in the chat. So if you guys want to play along with this thing, you can. Where's the chat? So this is a notebook which I found in a tutorial series. So there's a whole bunch of other notebooks in this category. I wanted to walk through this one with you guys. So firstly, we're using this library called Pytorch Geometric, which I mentioned before. There's other libraries now. This is one that I'm familiar with. If you're having trouble installing it, there's Docker images, if you're familiar with Docker, that have it pre-installed. You can do it in Google Colab, which is easy to have it installed. You can try to find someone to help you install it. Once you have it installed, then you can get to work. So there's a whole lot of algorithms that come built into this, which is why it's so nice. What I mentioned, just a handful, but really people have gone crazy with developing graph convolutional variations. And so what we're going to look at here is molecular property prediction. So the other nice thing is that there are publicly available data sets that people have already put together. So you can not have to do this yourself. So the one that we're going to look at is called this TU data sets. This one. So let's take a look at that. So it's just a benchmark data set that you can use. There's various ones that are there. And so here, what we're going to try to predict is whether a molecule inhibits HIV virus replication or not. That is really the setting here. Yeah. And so let's hit play here. And while it's playing, I'm going to explain what's going on here. So this function just loads in the sample data set into memory, and then just prints a bunch of parameters of it. So you can see here that there's 188 graphs here. It's not a huge data set. The graphs have edges, there's various properties of them. This is typically what we're looking at here. One thing that you can note is that each of these graphs is different, right? They're different molecules, and that's part of that's one of the cool things you get from this, is that like in images, it's always the same dimension. Like if it's 28 by 28 pixels, it's always 28 by 28. In this domain that we're in, the actual structure of what you're looking at can change. So this is a much more powerful framework to do neural networks in. Anyways, we have our data set, and we're just going to shuffle it. We're just going to do some arbitrary splitting of training and test set, and then we're going to start mini batching it. And so in the example they give is really that, we're just going to take these graphs, representations of our data, we're going to put them into this graph net, and we're going to just run them there. Now the really cool thing here is that you essentially have two inputs. So I think what they have here is I think there's two molecules that are coming in, and you're comparing them against each other. So in this example, that's what they're doing. And so let's look at just enumerating what this does. So let's run this cell. And so this is, again, another data loader. So what I mentioned before, the data loader is just an iterator. We just give it our training data set, and we give it some basic parameters like batch size. You can tell it to shuffle in this case. and it'll shuffle your data every epoch, and it'll iterate through it for you. So every time you call next on this, it'll give you 64, which is what you needed. If you go down, there's some explanation of how these works, but we can just skip straight to the code here. This is similar to what I showed before, how you create a neural network in Pytorch. You subclass this neural network.module, initialize all your layers in the init method, and then you define a forward method. Now, in the case of this geometric library, your forward method has a few additional parameters. You have what's called an edge index, which tells you what the edges are in your graph, in addition to the actual data that you have. And so here we have, instead of a convolutional layer, we have a GCN conv layer, which, it just takes the number of input features and the number of output features. So the number of input features is the number of features on each vertex in your graph. So for example, each atom in your molecule could have different parameters you're interested in using as input. So for example, it could be a one hot vector. So it could be like, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. Each of those is getting a one hot vector in the input, for example. And then you can have as many channels in the output as possible, and you can just keep looping over and over. It's similar to what I showed before with the previous example, except now we're just using these convolutional layers. And the nice thing about this from a coding standpoint is structurally it's all the same, right? You actually don't need to know too much about the inner workings. Like this is what we had before. Notice how it looks so similar to what we had. You really just define your layers. You don't need to you don't need to create it. You don't need to know all this fancy harmonic analysis. You just go to the library, you choose which layer you want. And as long as you have your input output relationship, it's super easy. And the forward, super easy. You're just applying the layers one at a time. And really that's it. You just hit play and it's just going to instantiate that. The training loop is the same as before. It's always the same structure. You make your prediction from your input. You compute your loss from your prediction. You call loss.backwards to compute your gradients. And then you step your optimizer to update your parameters. And then you clear the gradients. So these 5 steps, that is really the essence of what you need to do in deep learning. This is your bread and butter. Right? And so if we hit play, it's just going to start training this thing. And it's just going to slowly, continuously measure the test accuracy and the training accuracy of whatever we're working on. And in this one, they mentioned a bunch of other stuff, which we only need to talk about. Like you can play around with it. So like in this example, I changed the actual type of layer that you have. So before they had something called a GCN conv. Now they suggested here to play around with different types of convolutional layers and see what types of accuracies you get. If we go to the documentation for this library, you can see that they have a billion different layers. So you can just go to this, read the docs, and these are all the different layers they have, along with the papers where these layers were defined. So AGNN conv, you can look at which paper this was, why they defined it that way, and go to the next one, APPNP layer, right? So the nice thing about this, as the way it's structured, is it's really easy to latch on to people's research. So normally it's really hard to read a paper like this and then say, oh, I want to use this algorithm, right? But if you open this PDF and you try reading it, this is pretty complicated. And it's not trivial to just say, I want to use this algorithm and I want to do stuff with it. But with the way these libraries are written, they actually make it easy for you to do that. So definitely something that you can play around with. Once you get the essence of the input-output relationships down, you can really do a lot of things with it. So are there any questions about that? If not, I wanted to just mention briefly some data sets that are out there.
Somebody is asking about, can you show the data attributes which is used?
Sorry?
Somebody is asking about, can you show the data attributes which is used here?
The data attributes. I don't, for which one? What are those? I don't understand the question. Yeah, I mean, you mean the model attributes? Let me see, we can print those. So model dot named parameters. Let's print it and see what we get.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you for such presentation. Actually, you have imported some inbuilt data set. So if we want to replicate that study, like we want to predict some inhibitors, so which type of data attributes, like what type of data we will take from the research article and how we will curate that thing. So can you say, can you show the data properties, which data you have imported?
Yeah, I can show you. So,
Okay,
or I can show you in, like, I can go to the public data sets that are available. So this was just some example where I think they just were using the, so do you know about one hot vectors? Maybe I should have explained that because I don't know if everyone is familiar with that. Can show a picture. So the idea behind a one hot encoding is, let's say you have a bunch of categories. So in this case, our categories might be amino acids. So you have like, glutamate, alanine, threonine, whatever. You keep going. For each one, you assign a unique vector with just a zeros everywhere and a 1 in a different index. And this is your starting point. And this way, instead of starting with letters and words, you start out with vectors. And so this just quickly gets you to a quantized representation of where you are. And so the simplest thing you can do if you want to predict drug properties using this methodology is you have a graph, and at each vertex in your graph, you have a vector, which is the one hot vector corresponding to whatever you were looking at. So if you're looking at a molecule, a small molecule, you do one hot encodings for each atom. If you were looking at proteins, peptides, you would do a one hot encoding for each amino acid, for example. And you would just use this methodology, and that would be your starting point. Now you could add additional properties if you wanted to, like, I don't know, you could put like binding energy in there. Like if you know that information, you could put, various, like maybe information about the bond type. The double bond is hydrogen bond. Maybe you could put distances. You could label the edges, for example. You could put the molecular distance. You could put, you could try encoding these things as well on top of it if you wanted to. Yeah.
okay, thank you.
Yeah. So there is something called the Therapeutic Data Commons. This was actually released, I think, this year or late 2020. There's a lot of data sets in here for drug design related activities. So a lot of it is small molecules. A lot of it is peptides. And so I recommend looking at this, tdcommons.ai. And they have a variety of resources to get you started in a variety of computational chemistry tasks. So they have data sets here. You can just go through some of the data sets that they have. They have things like predicting ADME properties of small molecules, predicting toxicities, predicting reaction yields. They have lipids, they have peptides in here as well. They have some data sets that are proteins. So like they have this one peptide MHC. So what this one is, given a list of peptides, you want to predict the binding affinity to MHC. There's another one that is antibody antigen affinity prediction. Given a set of peptides, predict, how strongly they're going to bind to each other. I had just in a terminal, I had it open just so I can show you some of it. So let me show you like an ADME data set. So here's a data set that is for predicting absorption, yes or no, of this particular molecule. And so you essentially you get a data frame, a pandas data frame, and you get this, and you get for each thing you get the label, which is yes, no, and you get the drug SMILES structure. And from this SMILES structure, if you want to, you can convert it to a graph. You can do whatever you want with it. You can do a recurrent neural net with it. The idea is that you put this as your starting point for your data set. There's another one that I wanted to show you, Peptide Mhc, which is pretty, so this is a peptide related one. So I'm going to show you what that looks like. So you have a peptide here. You have MHC identifier, you have MHC sequence, and then you have a binding affinity. So this is how this data set is structured. And you can see it's just a convenient way to jump straight in if you're interested in any of these tasks. If you are interested in more general stuff, there are libraries that will let you take a PDB protein, for example, and convert it into a graph, and then you can do things with it. Most likely, if you're just interested in taking something that you were doing in your lab and applying machine learning to it, you have a data set of whichever compounds you were looking at. You have their structure. You would want to take those molecules. You would want to put them into this framework. Like you would want to get the SMILES ID, for example, and then you would just want to do this operation on it. Let's say you have like not that many. Maybe you have 100. Maybe you have 20. You don't really have enough to do any sort of fancy machine learning on it. I would recommend you look into something called transfer learning, which is you take pre-trained networks that people have done in these large studies. You use those as starting points, and then you take your small data set that you've collected in your lab and you overlay that on top of them. Another thing you can do is you can take a look at some of these papers that have done molecular fingerprints. Like I gave the one example here at the end. Apply this fingerprint algorithm to compress your molecule and use that as a starting point for doing traditional machine learning, like random forest, logistic regression. This will give you better performance than if you were just to go straight to your machine learning, because the fingerprint helps compress your data. So those are some practical tips you can use if you want to really apply these and not do anything too crazy. I have an example of how you would convert SMILES. I don't know if you guys are familiar with SMILES. It's a format for representing molecules in text format. There's a library called PySMILES. It'll let you work with this. This is also sample code that I found online. So this is all stuff that I found and just I'm walking you guys through. But I'll just walk through this really quickly. You have to install all these things to get going with them. And so I just hit play again. So it's installing them all over again now. I think I can keep going. Yeah. So this is just a bunch of imports. I'm going to try and go to the code that I want to show you how the one-hot encoding works. So here I'm just loading in my ADME prediction data set. Nothing crazy. And here I'm just making my training label, sorry, my example label pairs. And the way that we're going to do this one-hot thing is here we list out a bunch of elements, all the elements that could possibly be observed in our molecules. And what we're going to do is we're going to have this function called element to one hot, which you loop through. So if I look at before on what I had, so you loop through every element of this, and you see like you start off with carbon, and carbon is way out here, And so you have a vector of length, like whatever the length of this is, like say it's 30. And then at position 30, you're going to assign a 1, which is going to correspond to carbon. And so let's take a look at what that gives you. Let's see. Yeah, so that, I mean, that's what it gives you. I think I can show you later on what that looks like. But then they also define this function, which here we're trying to predict absorption, right? And so if it's 0, if the final output of the model is 0, we return this one hot vector of the label. And if the final output is a 1, we return this one hot vector of the label. And just as before, so what we're doing here is we need to convert the smile strings into graphs. And so what we're going to do is PySmiles has this function called read smiles, and it just lets you convert those into a graph. So if I add an additional cell here, I can show you like print G. Where'd it go? Why isn't it printing? Okay, it's not printing. Print feature. Okay, that printed. So G is a graph. G is a network X graph. If you know, it's a graph in another library. But like these are all matrices. This one. So feature is just a vector of these one hot things that I showed you before. Because this is a biological compound, it's mostly carbons. And so, you know, G is the ones at the end which correspond to the carbon. What is about the edges? You know, this is basically a vector representation of like element 0 is connected to element 1. This is just describing the graph. You can print the index and so on. You know, I'll post this in chat as well so you guys can look at it. This is the blueprint for how you would chat is disabled. Why is chat disabled? I don't know why chat. Okay, I don't know. Chat is disabled, so I can't share this right now. But as before, we just do what I. So we're gonna construct a training and test set by combining all of these things together. So I just run this, and then let me show you what the training set looks like. Correct. Train of 0, and so it's just an object which is used in this library to represent data. And as before, we're going to define our network. The network, again, it's super easy to define these. You have your initializer, initialize your layers. You have your forward function, which just goes and tells you how to compute the operation. Nothing fancy, right? It's all the same boilerplate over and over again. We have our boilerplate for initializing CUDA, initializing our optimizer, initializing our loss function, and then we have our training loop. So what are we going to do? We're going to move the data to the device. In this case, they do the 0 grad first. You can do it first or last. It doesn't matter. You have prediction, loss, backwards, right? That's the essence. Everything in between is like formatting, right? But it's predict, loss, backwards, step. That is it, right? If I hit enter, it's going to start doing stuff. I think what you want to take away from this is you can convert smiles representations of molecules, which is a very easy thing to get for any molecule, to a graph, and then you can use this library to start doing machine learning on them using this methodology. I think this is very powerful because even if you're not interested in neural networks, this gives you a way to represent molecules, which is, if you think about it, is not easy to do. How are you going to represent a graph as a vector? This gives you a way to do that. So even if you just want like a fingerprint, you can use this, and then you can use traditional machine learning to do whatever you were doing. And then here we evaluate. It's not a big deal what the evaluation is, but like here we have an example on vitamin C. It says vitamin C will be absorbed. So that sounds good. Vitamin C is water soluble, so that's good to know. But yeah, I think that's all the demo code that I wanted to walk through. I know it's late in India, so I don't want to keep everyone too long. I think if people have questions, that might be good to go through questions.
Okay, that's great, sir. Thank you.
Mhm.
And please share this link with us. Okay,
Yeah, I
thank you.
just shared the link. of
Okay,
the-
one more thing, sir. Can we say this is advanced type of QSAR? Like we are converting our general descriptor into the graph type of thing, and after that we are applying the neural network in this. So can we say that thing that okay, this is the advanced type of QSAR method, or this is just a
QSA?
question. QSAR. Actually, in traditionally we use the smile, and then we use some methods, regression method, and
Mhm.
after that we can classify that okay, on the basis of these descriptors, this can be absorption type compound, or this has good metabolic profile, or something like that, or we can predict the inhibitors also. So
Yeah.
and here you are using the graph theory to classify all these things. So can we tell those things actually?
I think
This
this is better. So I think in QSAR, you're sidestepping your problem because you're calculating these aggregate properties of molecules and you're using them as input. But why would you expect that to be useful? Like, why would things like boiling point and solubility and these things, why would you expect that to be a useful representation of your molecule? I mean, it gives you useful information, but it's not unique. Like there's this problem of uniqueness where it's not specific. There's a lot of molecules that will have that boiling point and that solubility and stuff.
Yeah.
And chemistry is complicated. A lot of the phenomenon that happens is because of subtle stereochemistry, subtle, just binding the geometric properties of the compound you're interested in. You're not going to capture that fully with this QSAR thing. So I think that this is really a way for us to have more powerful models than what you would get if you just, did that approach.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Mhm.
As participants having any doubts, you can unmute yourself and ask the doubts. If there are no further doubts, can I ask Rohit to conclude the session?
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Saad. You have introduced very well that how we can understand the neural networks, and after that how we can apply those neural networks to predict the chemicals, different type of chemicals properties and other things. And I hope the students also got the mathematical background that okay, which type of equations are using and how we can maximize those equations. So these all things you covered, and you have also shared the collab links. So this is a starting point if the students wants to explore those things. So maybe they can contact to you also, and I hope that organizer will provide your email address to the students also. And thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much for accepting the invitation. The lecture was very great. Thank you so much, Dr. Saad.
Yeah, thank you. I'll send those out and you can contact me if you have questions. Email.
Thank you, Saad. Thank you for your wonderful session on ANN. Can I conclude the session? Yeah, anyhow, participants will get the recordings. They can have the time for practicing. Somebody is asking about the books. Is there any basic books that could help us to understand?
Yeah, I posted a link in chat to a website that has a lot of resources. I mean, as far as books, if you have like, yeah, I know I can recommend books on like statistics, but that's not really, this is a very applied thing. So like, I don't know if you have taken like harmonic analysis, signal processing. I would really recommend just diving into the material and going from an applied perspective. So like the website I sent has, this is the paper that really introduced, I think, a lot of these ideas to the world. It has a lot of very powerful authors on it. And this is the one where this paper really gives a good overview of everything I described. If you look, there's a lot of review articles that explain, deep learning in chemistry, and this is one of the popular techniques that are used. So if you're interested in that, you can do it. I would say look at the therapeutic data commons that I mentioned for resources about data sets that are available as well.
Yes, that's good. I'm now concluding the session. Saad, thanks for accepting our invitation.
Mhm.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.